at your reactions, input, etc. on that. And what I'll try to do is give it some context that demonstrates how it's related to the session we'll be doing in October. So I've become fond of this phrase, does HR's reach exceed its grasp, lately? And now we go to the literary part of the talk that has specific meaning for the location I'm in, but I won't go into it, but the person standing next to me will enjoy this. There is a poem by Robert Browning, and that poem is the source of this quote, but a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's in heaven for. And the idea there in the poem, and it's often interpreted as being, this is hopeful for us because our reach can exceed our grasp. Basically, it means you can touch something with your fingers even if you can't quite grasp it yet. The poem, however, is about a gentleman called Andrea del Sarto, who was an artist, a painter. And he was a painter at the time of Michelangelo and Da Vinci. And he was, by all accounts, including theirs, a better technical painter than they were. And this poem is in part his lament that despite being a better technical painter, the fire and the passion that they had for their art made them more well-known and more better in terms of expressing and in having an impact on the world. And that, to me, has some similarities to some of the data that we're finding with regard to HR. In a nutshell, I think we need to think carefully about the idea of perhaps getting so fixated on our technical brilliance that we may be missing some of the bigger pictures on the horizon that offer the profession and you personally the opportunity to make very big impact in your organizations. So now I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the data that's driving that perception of mine and maybe that offering that idea. First of all, I want to give credit to my colleague Ed Lawler, whom Ed just mentioned, number 8 on the hit parade. And I want to talk in a moment about this survey that we do every 3 years of HR leaders. It's now global, and I'm about to talk about the data we just collected in 2013 and are now producing and writing into the book. What I want to draw your attention to, though, by flipping back between these two slides, is the amazing resemblance that Robert Browning has to Ed Lawler. And that's obviously both in terms of physical appearance and also in terms of being prolific writers. So I'm hoping Ed won't take too much offense at my reference there. Now, on to talking a bit about the data. We'll take this up in the seminar next month as well in more detail, but many of you are familiar with this survey and familiar with one of our favorite questions, which is how an estimate by the HR leaders we survey, and it's about now 200 or 300 HR leaders worldwide, one per company across a bunch of leading companies. And we ask them how they spend their time. What percentage of your time is spent maintaining records, auditing and controlling, providing services, developing services, and being a business partner. And you can see that in the left-hand column. And the right-hand column shows the results for 2013. As you can see, for example, 26.9% of the time being a strategic business partner, at the top 15.4% of the time maintaining records. The column to the left of it shows what people said this time, that they remember the way they spent their time 5 to 7 years ago. As you can see, looking at the bottom, they remember spending only 14.2% of their time, and they remember at the top spending 27% of their time on maintaining records. The little numbers 1 on the right-hand side show where there's a statistically significant difference. So people remember significantly less time spent on strategic partnership and developing HR systems and more time on auditing and controlling and maintaining records. So that's interesting, hopeful data for the change in HR. That would say we're not like Andrea del Sarto, we're sort of changing our profession. But of course, and some of you are familiar with this story, this is the continuation of it. These are the data from the same question asked in 2010, 2007, 2001, and back to 1995 when Ed and Sue first started the survey. As you can see, looking at the bottom row or looking at the top row or looking at really almost any row, there is really not a lot of difference between the years. There is a little bit of a difference between 95 and 2013 that is significant, 21.9 to 27.2. So we do see perhaps some movement, but I think most people would say that if we just look at how HR is spending its time, there's certainly not the magnitude of movement that people remember, and we might call this, I would say, maybe kind of a glacial rate of change. Now, that doesn't mean the profession isn't terrific and isn't doing great things, but I think it calls into question whether we are moving quickly enough to take advantage of the opportunities the profession has in front of it. The next slide I just include to give you an idea about what we're discovering in the survey globally. This survey includes results from North America, Australia, and China for 2010 and 2013. I think the columns are fairly self-explanatory here. The big story is that Australia, in the middle, looks very much like the United States and did in 2010 as well. That's also true for Europe. So I'm using Australia as kind of a representation of a lot of Western countries. And then China, in 2010 and in 2013, is kind of an outlier. As you can see here, China's reported time spent on strategic partnership is significantly less than Australia and the U.S. If you look at the top row, China's time spent on maintaining records is significantly more. Throughout the survey, China appears to be what I would say is at an earlier stage of HR evolution, with generally less frequently doing strategic partnership, less frequently engaging in some of the advanced activities that we talk about. Again, that's meant as no criticism. It's more an observation of perhaps where the evolution is in China as an emerging country. So the message that I want to leave with you from these data, and the message that I take away, is we do have a profession that's changing. We all know about the changes, and I think we all read about those changes in the headlines of organizations. And I think what Ann and I have been talking about a bit here is it's quite easy to get the impression that there's a great deal of massive change in the profession. Certainly you're all working very hard, we're working on creative things, but in the broader scope of things, this survey, and I would say the data from a number of other kind of global HR surveys, suggests a slower pace of change, and in some cases maybe even what we might call kind of glacial change. Does it matter? Now, this is a very complicated graph. I'll just explain the pattern here for you really quickly. Again, what we have three sections here. Each section has an outcome variable. So the left one, to the left of the big black bar, is the correlation of how you spend your time with another question on the role HR plays in strategy, with more being more strategic. The middle area shows the correlation of how you spend your time with another question on HR's functional effectiveness. And the right-hand part shows the correlations with another question on the performance of your organization. So when the bars go up, it means there's a positive correlation between that kind of time and the outcome. When the bars go down, it means there's a negative one. As you can see, in each of the three areas, the left two bars tend to go down pretty significantly. In pretty much all three countries, that means that the more people said they spend time maintaining records or auditing and controlling, the less high they rated themselves on HR's role and strategy, effectiveness, and organization performance. The right-hand bars, developing HR systems, being a strategic partner, tend to go upward in each of the three sections and within each of the three sections. And that suggests that the more time people reported spending on developing HR systems, and particularly strategic business partnership, pretty consistently, the more likely they were to rate themselves higher on organization performance, HR effectiveness, and role and strategy. So at the top, I've kind of summarized. It appears that how you spend your time does associate with outcomes that matter, and that this pattern of spending time on strategic business partnership is associated with positive outcomes. So, I see Andrew's question to me: do you see the same data for the EU compared with the U.S. and Australia? And Andrew, that's Andrew Chandler. We do, both in terms of the averages that you saw before, and also in terms of, I believe we also see the pattern you see in this graph as well, where we're doing correlations. But to be perfectly accurate, I haven't done these correlations for the EU and Europe broken out. Although that'll be included in the book that Ed and I will publish later this year on these data. So thanks for the question. So the message to me is there is change, but it's relatively glacial. There is the way we spend our time, as well as other questions we ask, matters, and the change in those questions tends to be relatively slow. So there are a couple of conclusions we might draw relative to the topic of today. One question, I think, is that if we're changing relatively slowly in the broad scope of the profession, that doesn't mean that any one of you is necessarily slow to change, but the idea is the profession seems to be changing relatively slowly. Are we changing quickly enough to pick up the opportunities on the trends that are emerging? You know, are we sort of like Del Sardo, being very good technically and working very hard on the traditional technical things when there are these other passionate opportunities available to the profession or to you and your organizations that we might be missing? The other one is that this time spent on strategic partnership does seem to matter to organizational effectiveness. And is there a way that spending more time or being more effective as strategic partners might help us to not only improve our contribution to the organization today, but understand where we can take advantage of emerging trends? And that strategic partnership connection would be the connection to the session in October, where we have tools and that sort of thing for analyzing strategy. So someone asked if I could, and I'm happy to answer one more question on this, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. That, again, it's not that it's not a great question, but I do want to be sure that Ed and I may come back to this later, and I wanted to be sure we talked a bit about the trend. So the question that came in was, if we look on the right-hand part of the graph under organization performance, we see very little, very short bars in the North America segment of that, to the very left of that section. So that's like the third column to the left is those little tiny bars. And someone asked, could I comment on the small correlations with organization performance for North America? You're certainly astute in noticing that. It does appear that the general correlations with organization performance on this question in North America are less than the correlations in Australia or China. That has a lot to do with the range of responses that you get on each question. I don't know that it suggests that these activities don't necessarily correlate with organization performance, but it is true that we got a somewhat less variance in that question in North America. Also, the bars are generally shorter in that section because there are so many things that could affect organizational performance. So it's a great question. To be honest, I don't know that Ed and I have come to ground yet on exactly why that would be. Obviously, there could be a lot of explanations there. So again, thanks for the question. Hopefully that answered your question. And if it's okay, I think I'll move on now just to use this as context for a couple of other things. So that's data set one, the survey that Ed and I are completing now and writing up for the book. And again, Ed and I will be doing some webinars in the future about this for sure. So I want to talk now to you about the data that we gathered from this consortium of 11 companies, each one with about 20 or 30 HR leaders. And we had a sample of those leaders respond to multiple surveys over the course of about 2 or 3 months, each survey presenting them with 2 issues. And then they responded, as I'll show you, to some questions about those issues. So let me get to the data and you'll understand what we did. So this graph reflects a question shown at the top that asked, what is the role of HR in applying this trend? And you can see the trends at the bottom of the graph: globalization, generational diversity, sustainability, etc. So what this graph represents is the average answers to the question of what is HR's role in applying this trend. In other words, each of the sets of 2 bars is one of the trends. And what's the role of HR in applying this to issues inside of HR? And then the purple bar is now, and the blue bar is what it should be. So this is HR's opinion about the role that they play in each of these trends, as it is now, purple bar, and as it should be, blue bar. And you can see the scale. 1 is no role, all the way up to a key leader and expert role, right? So you see these trends. I've ordered the trends in the order of the purple bars. In other words, they go from where HR has the greatest role today, 3.75, or about, if you look at the top, somewhere between active support role and primary input, all the way to, on the right, for gamification, an average of 1.91, so somewhere between no role and an occasional role. So the purple bars sort of suggest that the left-hand term to the right, HR is involved, and as you move to the right, you get more and more emergent in the sense that HR has less of a role. What's striking to me is the blue bar, the light blue bar, that is, which is consistently above 4.0. That bar reflects what HR thinks its role should be now. In other words, for virtually every single trend, HR envisions itself and sees its ideal role as somewhere between a primary input role and a key leader and expert, even though in many of these trends, HR's current role is occasional or no role or at best active support. Again, here's the notion of man's reach exceeding its grasp. HR seems to want to lead across everything. That's probably not practical. And looking at some of these trends, it may not be the best way for HR to strategically make the best contribution. I'll talk about some of what Ian and I are finding about some of the best ways to do that. But the idea to me is this presents a real dilemma. There are many, many important trends emerging. HR seems to feel its ideal role would be to be a leader on all of them. The current role of HR suggests that it's pretty far away from that on some of the emerging trends. It seems to me to be a case where HR will need to pick its battles. HR will need to pick its most strategic territory for doing this. That brings me to the next slide, which is kind of a summary of the outline of the seminar that we'll do in October. Let me just see. I've got one question on this graph. It's a question of clarification. Yeah, so when we say the role of HR inside of HR, what I mean, the way that question was phrased was it means the role of HR in applying these trends to the issues that arise in the HR domain, employment issues. So we had a separate question that was the role of HR in applying these trends to issues that arise, let's call it outside of HR or in the organization more generally. Those data, the data about HR applying these trends outside of HR to the organization more generally, are not here. So what you're seeing, we do have those data, and I guess that was Deanna who asked about them. There actually some of these data available on the website at the center, and we can certainly give you some sense of what that looks like. It's fairly similar actually to these data about applying HR to issues inside of HR in the employment relationship. So what you're seeing here is questions about HR's role in applying these trends to the issues that arise, let's call it inside of HR, inside the HR profession, employment issues. That's how we phrased it. There were separate questions about HR's role in applying these trends outside of HR. In general, the bars tend to be lower, which we would expect because HR wouldn't have such a strong role in applying these trends outside. And in addition, the bars followed the same pattern, basically. And of course, Sissy asked a question about, doesn't this assume that the leaders who participated in the survey are able to accurately evaluate their own performance and are credible and knowledgeable about what we should be doing? I've not always found that to be the case, and you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right in the fact that we're taking these data from the people who gave them to us, and we're drawing conclusions from the data based on their perceptions, and implicitly then assuming that those perceptions have significance. I don't know that I'd go as far as to say that we have to assume that these perceptions are, accurate in the sense of some kind of normative accuracy, like temperature or something like that. I know that's not quite what you're saying, Sissy. Your point is well taken. This is certainly dependent upon the accuracy and the credibility of the people answering. Again, what we have here are 20 to 30 directors of HR in 11 of the companies that are center sponsors and chose to be a part of this survey. It may be that we get different results with other organizations. I would say that my guess would be that given the sample of organizations we had and the sample of people we had, that we're looking here at leading organizations. We're looking here probably at organizations where HR would be as involved in these trends as we're likely to see elsewhere, and where, and indeed, where HR's aspirations would likely to be pretty high, because they tend to be what I would call exemplary organizations, the ones that you read about, et cetera. I suspect if we did this survey with a broader sample of HR, we would see the bars lower. Certainly the purple bars would be somewhat lower. I don't know for sure what we'd find in the light blue bars. Probably lower, but I have a feeling this pattern of HR believing it should be a leader, even though it's pretty far away, would hold up, even if we had a different sample. Thanks for the question. So I wanted to just touch on the connection between these data, and we'll do a bit more with some of the specific trends in a moment. But for now, I wanted to touch on the connection with the seminar in October. The slide you have here is a slide that is sort of the basis of the October seminar. It lists on the left the 5 lenses that I suggest in that seminar that HR people can use to better understand their strategy and better understand the talent, well, let's call them the talent pivot points that are likely to be vital to their strategy. The lenses are a smorgasbord, a menu, rather than a set of requirements. So people choose which lens they use and which one gives them the most insight, and maybe they use 1 or 2 of them. And I'm not going to go through this in detail, but what I want to get at is if you look at the questions on the right, for example, at the top, who are our competitors? What are the major assumptions that we make about our industry? If you look at the process row 2 from the bottom, where does the performance of specific business processes most directly limit what we want to achieve? Which constraints are most critical? Those kinds of questions about the strategy get you pretty deep into the strategy, and then by extension, it allows you to begin to think about where would talent make a big difference in the answer to this question. So where would talent make the biggest difference to a process that's vital to us for our future success? Where is our talent going to make the big difference at the top row on whether our assumptions are correct or incorrect, or how we hedge our risk in terms of those assumptions? So the reason I raise these is that I believe questions like this can give you a clue, a very deep understanding of your strategy. With that understanding, I believe it's possible to go back to these trends and begin to think about in which of these trends could our attention make the biggest difference to where our organization is going. Some of these trends, for example, are going to be very relevant to the competitive positioning of some of you. For others of you, that particular trend will not be that relevant, and it's going to be something else. Some of these trends are going to be very relevant to the processes and resources that you need to attend to. For others of you, it would be a different relationship between the trends and those resources. And indeed, that's what we found in our work with this consortium of companies, is in many cases we found that people were addressing the trends that had the greatest strategic relevance separately in their organization. When I say separately, I mean, for example, if you're a consumer goods organization, something like segmentation and gamification is a very big deal in your strategy. So what we found is that the leading organizations tended to be saying, we're not trying to boil the ocean, we're focusing in using a strategy analysis to find the trends that are most vital, and then stepping back and saying, what are the talent implications and our implication as leaders in those trends? So with that, what I wanted to do was just turn to, and again, I appreciate the typing of the questions. It's very helpful. What I'm going to do now is take a few of the trends that I just showed you. So you can see the first slide for big data here. And I'm going to define the trends, give you a sense of what we found is the current HR activity in those trends, and then give you a sense of some things that we think may be on the horizon that represent perhaps some of those Del Sarto or Michelangelo opportunities, but are not getting as much attention yet. So that's kind of the next step, is we'll do a few of these trends just to give you some ideas. And again, the notion is, as you think about your own work, given often the distance between where HR is and where it would like to be, can we use a strategic perspective to decide where we're going to devote our attention? So before that, let me go back to this slide and just stop talking and see if there are people who might want to raise their hand by using the button on your screen. It says raise hand down there, and let us know you'd like to ask a question verbally or orally through the speakers. So I'll give it a minute and see if anyone has a question they'd like to pose by raising their hand and talking. And I'll ask Carrie and Lacey to help me watch the list to see which of you might raise your hand. Okay. So I don't see any hands, so I will.
You have one hand, Jason Williams.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, Jason, I was scrolled to the other part of the screen. Jason, so I think I see you're unmuted. what's your question?
Yeah, John, great research and insights. I do wonder, and this question comes in part from the slide you went to. I wonder how many of these topic areas are actually driven by, I'll call it, thought leaders outside of HR around what HR should be doing. So the slide you showed after this one was, I'm sorry, go to the next slide with the 3 insights on it, right? So that came from Deloitte. And I often see, it seems like the driving force around where HR should be focused comes from outside. It doesn't often seem like that thought leadership is coming from inside of HR. And I'm wondering what, from your opinion, what type of effect that has on HR really setting a true north based on what we actually think versus being guided by external consultancies.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question that has got my brain thinking probably quicker than my mouth can catch up, honestly, Jason. It's a terrific question that I had not thought of lately. It's a question that comes up a lot in some separate work that I'm doing with the Society for HR Management and the National Academy of HR and a couple of other organizations around, how we would find that true north and where the source of direction for the HR profession should come. I think it's also one of the reasons that Ed and I do this survey of HR leaders in organizations, is to begin to get a sense from them as well. I think your point is well taken. If I go look for the headline-making examples, I'm going to find them very often coming from the writings of consulting firms, and to a certain extent also the writings of some of the trade publications or even the business publications. And I think if I'm understanding your point properly, I would agree with you that we need to think carefully about whether those sources, including the center and some of the work that we do as well, which are terrific sources of information, whether they may or may not fully represent where our true north would be. It's definitely the case that I think virtually all of these organizations would say this is true, that they're looking for the edgy stuff, that they're looking for the human interest, that they're looking for something that would surprise you. Certainly that's true when I write my columns. I try to find something that's sort of surprising or edgy or out on the horizon a little bit. So I think, and again, it kind of goes back to Ed and my conclusion from our data too. I think what you find is the presentation of HR tends to be out on the edge, and the things that get the most interest and the biggest headlines, and I think that drive an interest in a center like ours, or an interest in working with a consulting firm, may be that they can present something we hadn't thought about before. That contrasts a bit with what appears to be a more, I might call it glacial to get attention. We might call it a more circumspect or more steady kind of progress in HR in the real world. And that contrast, I think, is an interesting one. I would agree, if this is your point, that it's not up to HR in any given organization to try to sort of catch up to everything that we see out on the horizon, and I don't mean to make that implication here. That said, so I think you're right on that in any organization, HR's true north is going to need to be defined in a much more strategically circumspect way. A lot of this is about saying no. A lot of this is about saying what we're not going to do. And I would not recommend that any HR organization ought to be trying to be a leader across all of these trends. And I'm pretty sure I speak for my good colleague Ian Ziskin, who helped with this research on that as a research partner. Mostly I want to give him credit, but I think Ian's sensibilities are that way as well. So you're right. What I'm going to show you is kind of the headlines that suggest to me that these opportunities exist on the horizon. What I think they pose is some really interesting questions for individual HR practitioners like you to say, have I thought about where my own personal career and personal emphasis needs to be across trends like this? Am I the Del Sardo, staying in my comfort zone, doing my technical work, when the Michelangelo and Da Vinci world of the art of HR is perhaps passing me by? Or at the other extreme, am I trying so hard to capture every possible image I can as a painter that I'm really not doing a good job with any of it? And somewhere in the middle, And I think very much driven by the kind of deep strategy consideration that these questions might engender, and that we sort of try to motivate in the October session. I think that's one of the ways that we sort of get to a place where we can take this list of trends that I'm showing now in the graph and winnow them down to the ones where we personally ought to be attending and the ones where our HR organization ought to be attending, and sort of find that middle ground between the headlines, which are very tempting and very evocative, but would suggest maybe we have to be, you know, everything to everybody, and yet also avoiding the idea of saying, well, that's just consulting firms, that's just, you know, that's just the kind of thing to get our attention. We don't need to think about that yet because it isn't relevant to us. I'm hoping that's, let me just see if that, did that help at all, Jason, with the question?
It did. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a terrific question. Thanks very much.
You also have Scott who has a hand up.
Okay.
Hi, John. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Thank you.
John, I guess I just have a thought. In terms of this research, has it been framed along the lines of, I guess I recall the classic paper by, I think it was Delaray and Dottie, on modes of theorizing in strategic human resource management, looking at what they called the universalistic, the contingent versus the configurational models. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it seems like HR might have its general functions that we perform, and if we just try to correlate certain aspects of organizational performance with general HR activities or programs, it's not aligned. But if you start to look at that contingent and configurational strategic approaches, whatever the organization's focus might be, innovation, growth, service, technology advancements, it seems like it boils down to that alignment aspect. Yeah. So that's, I mean, I love that. Good for you, Scott. I mean, I love the reference to the academic literature, and I mean, this is just, you're just warming my heart here. This is exactly what the Center for Effective Organizations is supposed to be about. So the Delaray and Doty stuff and stuff by Scott Lepak, or Dave Lepak rather, and others on HR strategy, you know, it's a terrific observation that you've made here. We can think about the connection between HR and the organization in terms of you know, some sort of, and you did the three terms very well, but you know, some sort of best practice that would apply across all organizations, or some sort of a contingent alignment that would still be a kind of best practice for your organization, and we could sort of line up each of the practices contingent on your strategy. You know, training ought to look this way if we're innovative, recruitment ought to look this way if we're innovative. And then there's a configural one, which is more like saying this is more complex than just a linear lineup of what we do with the strategy. It's actually a configuration of a sort of more nuanced configuration where some things may correspond, some things may look a little bit different. There are places that we're going to push hard, like if we're in high growth, it may be very vital that our input part of HR, the recruiting and staffing, et cetera, is very, very well aligned with strategy. To be honest, it may not matter so much if some of the development parts are well aligned with strategy, if we're in a very high growth environment where the input side is going to make the biggest difference right now. So again, I'm just trying to get at some of the theory behind configural and aligned, et cetera. The point is really well taken, and I think, again, to try to do justice to some of the writing of my academic colleagues, beneath that, the engine is that someone somewhere is going to understand the organization's goals and objectives, and basically deeply enough understand what we might refer to as strategy, even though that strategy may be changing all the time, and be able to make some judgments about whether we need to be aligned, whether we need to be configural, or whether there are certain best practices, like something like, you know, payroll needs to be done a certain way, and it's really not going to make that much difference that if we push hard on being innovative about payroll. So that might be in that third category of something that's more general. Again, so I think my answer would be, Scott, that I absolutely agree that there's a great deal for the profession to do about thinking about what we mean by the correspondence between what we do in HR
and the strategy of the organization. Is it configural? Is it an alignment question, or is it something like a general best practice question? And I think one of the engines that's going to make that run is some way for the organization to translate its strategy into the implications about talent, and then begin to make choices with regard to where we configure, where we align, where we go with best practice. Again, one tool offering that we can make at the center is the tools in the strategy and strategic impact seminar and some of the writing that we've done on that. Again, it may not be these tools that you use, but I think somewhere, somehow, organizations have to get better at that connection between strategy and talent, and that's going to be a key to making practical some of the research that we've talked about here. And again, I think in terms of these themes, I think it goes back to the idea of picking your spots on these trends and doing it in a way that is related very specifically to the organization challenges that you face. On the big data slide, and again, for the Myers-Briggs J's in the room, and I say this a lot, it's pretty clear now that we're not going to cover every single slide that I had ready. I'm really enjoying this discussion, and we're going to definitely get to what I wanted to accomplish here. People looking at the big data slide, I think Chad was saying, big data has to be more than just HR data. It's got to include finance, operations, forecasting, et cetera. That's why HR doesn't excel in this area. And you're not wrong about the idea that our consortium and data suggests that it is big data in its fullest form is going to be a combination of data from lots of different places. In some ways, that's one of the things that defines big data, that it's very diverse and also, as you see here, unstructured. There's no question that you're right, that in its fullest form, big data is going to include data that could link up lots of different resources and different processes in the organization, including finance, operations, marketing, sales, et cetera. So no question about that. I think accepting that, we can also say that also presents some opportunities potentially for HR. On this slide, what I'm doing is just trying to provide you with the headlines that suggested to us that this is an emerging area that may have, and I'm just choosing a few. In other words, I'm not going to do all the trends you saw on the graph, but let's take big data as an example. It's a big deal, generating lots of jobs. Indeed, as Chad said, the statistics here reflect big data not just in HR, but big data more broadly. So the notion is that out there in the world, big data is emerging. At the bottom, we see perhaps the statistic Chad was reacting to. Only 6% of HR departments believe they're excellent in analytics, and more than 60% feel they're poor or behind. You agree that HR may or may not need to be the leader on this, and HR probably won't have to be the expert on data for marketing and finance. That said, I think there's a case to be made that it's worth HR considering if this is a strategic imperative for our organization, and if we can envision big data applications that would benefit from the disciplines of HR, the focus on employment. Perhaps big data is a place we ought to pay attention. As you can see, just to remind you about our study, big data is one of those areas on the right where HR is not very involved at the moment, but where they perceive themselves as being ideally somewhere in a primary input role to a leader when big data is applied to employment issues. So there is a bit of a gap there. The headlines today in HR, and perhaps Chad, I'm hoping this will get to your question a bit. What we see today in HR is very admirable leading companies that, in my view, are applying big data to the traditional areas of HR. So we see, big box retailers like Walmart and Wawa and International One Incorporated have built internal HR analytics departments. They're staffed with statisticians, et cetera. So that's one way that we can go to create some competencies within HR around big data. Let's go bring in the statisticians, bring in the algorithms, et cetera. There's a number of research projects and proposals at the center about analytics and sort of how firms build that. In financial services, the second bullet, a very common kind of headline here is we went and we analyzed one of our HR processes. In this case, they analyzed the schools where they were recruiting. They found that their traditional criteria of grades and school quality were actually not very predictive of unit revenues when people were placed in their units. So they shifted their recruitment from focusing so much on grades and school quality toward the things that seem to be more predictive. And again, if you'd like, we can give you the links to these studies. They were part of the consortium that we did. And again, while no one can take credit for the full $4 million improvement in revenues, to me, the idea here is they sort of looked at reams of data about where they were recruiting over many years and thousands of people, and found this conclusion that wasn't obvious at first, that something as intuitive as grades and school quality turned out not to be as predictive. Google's another good example. Our colleague Laszlo Bock has been doing a lot of interviews lately about the analytics work at Google. One of the things that Laszlo has been interviewed and has been suggesting is that when they went back and looked at the predictive value of these kind of high-tech, offbeat questions, like how many golf balls can you fit in an airplane, Laszlo is on record with a quote that says, when we looked at all the data across all of our applicants over many years, we found that those kinds of questions don't predict anything, as much as our engineers believed that they did. And in fact, I think he had a quote that said, what they do is they make the person asking the question feel smarter, but they're not helping us predict performance. And so at Google, they're using that conclusion to begin to think about how often they use those questions. This to me seems to represent where HR is today. It's terrific. It's leading edge, but it's kind of within that HR box. What would be an example of something I think is not getting a lot of discussion yet, but should, and is a place where I think HR might come to the table and be able to bring something unique and very specific to its own discipline. I've put up a slide here that is a diagram that came from Aristotle, actually, and it shows up everywhere when you look at this issue. It's Aristotle's diagram of the structure of a good dramatic story. The vertical axis is the tension you feel in the story and the tension that the author builds, and the horizontal axis is the time of the story, the timeline of the story. And as you can see, the idea here is, in an opening scene, you acclimate the person, and as you move to the right, you have first small crisis they have to encounter. And then you begin to build the story based on that crisis. And then there needs to be another crisis before you get to the middle of the story. And you sort of build up this sort of crisis relief, until you get to the climax on the far right. And then there needs to be a sort of resolution and denouement at the end of the story. And this diagram is a lot of fun to have in your hand if you're watching a film, or if you're watching a television show, or if you're reading a great book that's a great story. It is a metaphor for me of a question for HR. What the data suggests, what the neurology suggests, what a lot of the research is suggesting about big data, is that beyond the numbers, the tables, and the statistics, it is often the storyline that is going to get attention and get engagement. And indeed, what we find in working with companies, my colleague Robin J. Suthasan and I, when we wrote our book together, encountered an HR leader, for example, who said, I spent years showing my leadership team the statistics about the fact that we weren't geographically diverse enough in our leadership team as a global company. And every year they agreed with that. Every year they agreed to do something about it, and nothing happened. So I finally came to them in one year, and I gave them the pictures of 3 executives that had been passed over consistently for top leadership jobs over the last 3 years, and that represented global diversity. And they couldn't believe that these people hadn't been chosen. And they said, we have got to get underneath this. So she went back and she told the story of the precise evaluation history on each of those 3, and discovered that they were recognized as leaders, that they were evaluated as promotion material, but that no one wanted to pull them out of their current units because they were so valuable running the units they were in. And she built that up just like this graph with a storyline about, well, is it that they're not qualified? That's the first climax. No, we've resolved that, they are. Is it that you don't recognize them as qualified? No, we've resolved that, they are. What it is you recognize they're great, you recognize they ought to be promoted, and nobody has the courage to move them, was kind of the climax in her story. And at that point, they were deeply engaged in making some movements because she had made it so personal. So to me, this notion of storytelling, the notion of considering engagement, considering how brains work, All of that stuff seems to me to be an opportunity for HR, perhaps to break out of a traditional application of big data and get to something that is quite relevant to the profession. Now, I'm noticing that we're getting near the end of time. Let me just say that there are some findings about this in the consortium report, which is available on the center website, about each of these trends. There's also some additional material on sort of the headlines about these trends and some of the things that we found in our consortium as well. Again, my point today is just to say that if we think about, I'm going to shift upward again, the trends across here. To me, the finding from our consortium was that the leading organizations are picking their spots, whether it's big data, whether it's something else. There's an immense number of opportunities here, big data being the one that I've used here as an example. And pursuing those opportunities is probably a matter of making good choices, just as many of you have said in your comments, or if I'm interpreting them properly. Those choices depend on understanding strategy relatively deeply, and I think that's one of the key engines that's going to be necessary for us to get to picking our spots in a way that makes a lot of sense. So again, I apologize for the vertigo here. I'm just going to shift through a few of the other topics. I want to just touch on another piece of data here. One of the things that, and this is related kind of to the point about connecting the trends we're seeing to the idea of deciding when we're spending perhaps too much time being technically adept and not enough time thinking about something like storytelling or something like that, which would perhaps be more out of our comfort zone, less easily defined, but perhaps more impactful in terms of the art of HR, in terms of the passion of HR. What we find here is an interesting, to this notion of picking your spot. What this graph shows is the correlations between a question about whether other disciplines take the lead in the trend and in applying the trend to HR, and a set of questions that we use to reflect what I'll call advanced HR practices and the embracing of advanced disciplines by the profession. So think of it this way. We had a set of questions that asked, do you practice collective leadership? Do you embrace disciplines like anthropology, statistics, forecasting, risk? Do you engage in behaviors like reaching out reaching out of your professional function? So those were all put together. There's about 30 of those questions into one index that I'm going to call Advanced HR Practices and Disciplines. And then we correlated that index with a question that said, do other functions take the lead in applying this trend to HR issues? So when the bars go up, it means that the correlation is positive. The more advanced or futuristic the HR function said they were, the more they let other functions take the lead. Notice that the bars on the right go up. That means that the more advanced an HR function reported itself being, the more others took the lead. The left-hand bars tend to go down. The more advanced practices and activities you were engaging in, the less likely you said others were taking the lead. Now, we don't have this all figured out yet, but it suggests to me that there's a very nuanced approach to how we take on these trends. When they're established on the left, futuristic HR functions seem to let others take the lead, or seem to take the lead. When they're emergent on the right, futuristic HR functions tend to let others take the lead. So another way to think this through is, if it's so emergent that we're not experts in it yet, is the key to getting involved, looking around our organization, I would say with a very deep and precise understanding of our strategy, our processes, et cetera, finding which of these trends is being pursued in our organization, where we have existing expertise that we can draw on, and then bringing those experts into HR to help us. So are we bringing our marketers in to help us with something like segmentation? Are we bringing our risk analysts in to help us with something like big data? Are we bringing our supply chain people in to help us with something like optimizing the flow of talent across the organization and the ability of our flow to achieve things like diversity and leadership development? So this is, again, it's the beginning, I think, of, certainly it is for us, the beginning of a deeper look in these data from the consortium about what it means for HR to advance and what are the ways for HR to advance, this graph to me suggests that it isn't just a matter that HR needs to internally develop competencies. Rather, it needs to think carefully about where it reaches out and how it reaches out. Again, one of the other research arenas that we're working in is some work I'm doing with Ian Ziskin. I won't stay on this in detail, but this is also a part of the topic set for the not only for the October session that I'll be doing, but for some of the sessions that Ian and I are doing together and that Ian does on his own in terms of the professional development of HR. The idea that in order to get on with this evolution, HR needs to get comfortable reaching out, getting talent from outside. I talked about that. Venturing out, influencing beyond the company, becoming a contact point for external stakeholders, seeking out, finding unpopular truths, finding the truth that no one's talking about. Again, I talked about storytelling through big data. And then breaking out, leading transformational change, getting committed to being the discipline that understands how to make change happen. You saw that we have a number of seminars on that now at the Senate. In the seminar that will happen in about a month, one of the central ideas is that the key to this is not so much knowing the answers. In other words, if we, and Carrie, I'm just going to go forward one slide if I can here. Or two rather, one more up. So these are frameworks that we use in the session. This idea of the 5 lenses and the questions you saw underneath them, what are our core processes, what are our core resources, et cetera, those questions to me are at the heart of strategic understanding. Notice I didn't say the answers. The answers will often come from someone other than HR, but the questions and having a framework of questions that you use as a professional to understand strategy deeply, and in terms of this graph, to connect the efficiency of what we do with the effectiveness of our services, with the impact of our services on strategy, goes to asking the right question. So what I'm going to do, we have about 2 minutes left, I'm just going to give you a reminder about what happens when the right question isn't asked and how bad the world can be if someone in the room doesn't understand how to get to the right question. I'm hoping you're all familiar with Abbott and Costello. Here's what's going on if you look at the picture on the right. They have a person whose name is I don't know, playing third base in a baseball game. A person whose name is what is playing second base on the baseball game. And a person whose nickname is who is playing first base. And this is a classic case, I think, of what happens when we don't practice a good art of the question and step back and ask what's the right question. Harry, if you don't mind.
Well, let's see now. We have on our team, we have who's on first, what's on second, I don't know's on third. That's what I want to find out, the guy's name. That's what I want to find out, the guy's name. I'm telling you, who's on first, what's on second, I don't know's on third. You know the man to the baseball team? Yeah. You know the guy's name? Sure. Well, you told me the guy's name to the baseball team. Who's on first, what's on second, I don't know's on third. You ain't saying nothing to me yet. Go ahead and tell me. I'm telling you. You ain't saying nothing yet. Go ahead and tell me. Who's on first, what's on second, I don't know is on third. You know the guy's name to the baseball team? Well, go ahead. Who's on first? Yeah. I mean the guy's name. Who? The guy playing first. Who? The guy playing first base. Who? The guy on first base. Who is on first? Why are you asking me? I don't know. I'm asking you who's on first.
Okay, thanks, Terry. Thanks, Terry. So with that, I will conclude, and then I'll stay on a bit if people want to ask a question or two. So you just give it back to me, Terry. I'll finish up. Thank you. Just now to do sort of the commercial reminder. In my view, this idea of HR organizations developing an approach to understanding the connections between what they do in the bottom of this graph, the investments and policies and practices we initiate, and how those things flow up to create strategic success. The idea that the HR organization develops a set of questions and a framework, a set of lenses, let's call it, that allows them to organize and dig deeply into the strategy in one or more of these 5 areas, and then find the talent pivot points and the organization pivot points that make the biggest difference. And underneath all of that is a facility with a set of questions, and they don't have to be these, but some kind of common core set of questions that strategic partners understand and use together when they're working with businesses, so that the profession and the people in it and our organizations come together to talk about strategy in a common way, and we have a common understanding about how we translate that into people and organization implications. To me, that feels like an engine that will be one of the tools that will be at the heart of progressing, of avoiding the possibility of being Andrea del Sarto, whose reach exceeds his grasp because he is so technically good by everybody's admonition that he's almost worked too hard on technical greatness and missed the passion that Michelangelo and Da Vinci are seeing, even though they're less technically good painters. And also the other side of being so eager to be Michelangelo that we haven't paid attention to the technical need and to the nuts and bolts of what we do. So with that, we're at exactly the top of the hour. We certainly want to give folks the opportunity to leave. And if you'd like, I can stay on for a little while and answer some of the questions that were typed in. We can also get back to those separately as well. Again, thanks.
And John, thank you so much for the session today. I think that was great, and people by their questions really seem to enjoy it and find a huge amount of value and impact in it. So thank you for your time. For those of you on the line, again, if you have questions regarding the upcoming seminar, please feel free to visit the website, call our office, or reach out to me directly. Again, we look forward to having you attend our session, and there are still a few spaces available, so feel free to give us a call. Again, thanks, John, for your time. And if there are questions, we'll stay on the line for a few minutes.
So if somebody wants to unmute and ask a question, I'll stay on for a moment. The rest of you have a great day.
So John, I'm not seeing any hands, and it doesn't look like we have anything in the data log box. Let's give it another minute or so and go from there.
Yeah, I think there's only one in the box, that that question about HR innovating and taking risks, et cetera. That's the only one I missed, I think.
That must be private.
Yeah, Dominique Herman. Yeah, so I'll. Okay,
lots of thank yous. I'm getting lots of thank yous.
Yeah,
thanks, Rita.
Thanks to everyone who's saying thank you, if you can still hear us. I'll just do it quick.
I think Robert has a question.
Okay.
Hey, John. Good morning.
Hey.
My question was about the perspective of line leadership on some of the areas that you're covering, as opposed to the self-perception of HR, and whether or not the research that you guys have done has taken into account the perspective of the line and what their expectations are on these issues.
Yeah, it's a great question, Robert, and let's see, to directly answer your question, in terms of the trend work that I'm reporting, we did not include a sample of leaders outside of HR in that research. It wasn't any assertive decision as much as just the limits of, what we could accomplish. So we chose to do that research. It was the first time we've done that kind of consortium, and we chose to focus it on a sample of, 11 or 20 to 30 HR leaders in 11 companies. And we chose HR leaders because we felt we had access to them and they were likely to respond to our requests. I couldn't agree more with you that it would be really interesting to have a corresponding sample of leaders outside of HR, perhaps we might even say the constituents for HR, and get a sort of parallel set of data about their own thinking. I think in particular in that study, the idea of which of the trends the external constituents feel would be the ones HR ought to pay the most attention to might be really interesting, and it might help us sort of winnow down that tendency for HR to say we ought to be a leader in everything. Indeed, that's what we saw in the comments of the consortium, Robert, was people said, we're not trying to do it all. We're looking around and finding that our organization constituents are doing X, or they want us to engage in X, and we go there. I'll just finish and then say, in the sample that Ed and I are gathering, that is the sample I talked about at the beginning about the time spent, the 100 or 200 HR leaders, we did ask those HR leaders to provide the survey to someone in their organization outside the profession. I think it's just the the nature of the world. This time around, we got fewer of those non-HR surveys back, though we do have some, and we're analyzing some of those data. I'm not sure this time it will show up in the ultimate book, in part because we have so much more global data, and in part because we got a little smaller sample. But we do have some non-HR leader data in the survey that Ed and I have done, and indeed in the books that we've written in the past. You can see it on the screen, the book called Achieving Excellence in HR. You can find it's a fairly detailed report on the non-HR leader sample for each of the topics that we take on. Is that helpful, Robert?
Yeah, it is. Thanks, John.
You bet. Thank you. Okay.
I don't see any more hands.
Okay, good. Well, thanks to all of you that I can see hung in to this point. Again, thanks to Robert for the question. And obviously, if there's a question we didn't get to or you want to send in, please do that. And we'll look forward to seeing you on future center events.
Thank you, John, and thanks everyone for joining us.